The waiting room of St. Mary's Hospital was drenched in a cold, clinical light that flattened everything into shades of white and gray. Sarah Collins stood frozen beside the records desk, her fingertips resting on a file so thick the metal clip at the top could barely hold it closed. The label on the cover screamed in bold block letters, "Pending, 30 years." She swallowed and lifted the final page. The ink was fresh, the signature an impatient scrawl, an authorization for full pension, set to be issued in early April. Her breath caught. In 30 years of paper trails, delays, and bureaucratic dead ends, this was the finish line. But behind the glass wall of the ICU, Thomas Reed lay still, his face as pale as the sheet pulled up to his chest. A tangle of tubes and wires linked his body to machines that beeped and hummed with artificial life. 67 years old, Vietnam veteran. His chart read severe traumatic brain injury, bicycle accident. The nurse had explained it quietly. A distracted driver, eyes on her phone, had clipped his back tire. The fall had sent him into the air, his head striking the curb with a sickening finality. "Get the approval notice sent out," her supervisor said briskly, not looking up from his own pile of papers. "He's got everything on file. Don't let it get held up again." Sarah's throat tightened. Everything on file. The words felt heavy, obscene. She glanced once more at the man through the glass, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. The faint lines on his forehead hinted at a lifetime of discipline, of waking up at dawn, of folding sheets into perfect hospital corners. She wondered if he had known this letter was coming, if somewhere in his mind he was still waiting for it. She'd never met him before today. Yet she could picture the life behind those closed eyes, the little shack on the edge of a Midwest town, the scent of old wood and coffee, the bedspread taut enough to bounce a quarter. She imagined the boots lined up under the bed, their leather dark and polished, and the neat stack of folded shirts like a row of soldiers standing at attention. What had it been like to live that way for 3 decades, counting every dollar of a $1,133 monthly check, fighting dizzy spells that came without warning, scratching at arms that bore the permanent scars of Agent Orange exposure? She'd read the medical notes, patches of skin that looked as if someone had taken a small fork and scraped the flesh away, healing into a rough, uneven surface. The diagnosis, skin cancer. The symptoms, relentless itching, sudden vertigo. And yet every account she'd heard in the last hour painted the same picture. He was a strong man, stubborn even, quick to anger when faced with injustice, but never quick to complain. There was something both admirable and unbearable in that kind of endurance. Sarah could almost hear his voice from the lines written in the correspondence log, short clipped sentences, each one ending with the same official reply, "We're working on it." The phrase had been repeated so many times it had lost all meaning, like a rusted key that no longer fit any lock. Through the glass, a nurse adjusted the foreline. Thomas didn't stir. Outside, the day was pale and winter thin, the kind of March afternoon when the sun was out but you could still see your breath. Somewhere, in his shack, the bed was still made, the boots still in line, the radio probably sitting silent on the shelf, waiting for him to turn the dial. Sarah looked down at the letter again. A promise delivered 30 years late. What makes a man live in a shack for 3 decades, keep it military neat, and keep knocking on the same locked door until his knuckles are raw? What stories lie inside the stack of returned letters piled high as a soldier's field manual? If you're listening to this, hit that like button and tell us the city you're tuning in from, because you're about to hear the rest of Thomas Reed's story. Thomas Reed's shack sat at the far edge of town, just beyond where the asphalt road gave way to a strip of gravel that crunched under your tires. From the outside, it looked like something the wind might push over. Planks of weathered wood faded to a dull gray, a roof patched in more than one place with sheets of tin. But step inside, and you'd find order so precise it felt almost ceremonial. Every morning at 5 a.m., without fail, Thomas swung his legs out of bed, planted his feet squarely on the cool floor, and pulled the sheet tight enough to bounce a quarter. He worked the corners with quick, efficient tugs, smoothing out wrinkles until the bedspread looked as though no one had ever slept there at all. His boots, dark leather worn in at the creases, stood in a straight row beneath the bed, toes forward, polished to a muted shine. Above them, a small shelf held a neatly folded stack of shirts. Civvies, yes, but folded like dress uniforms. A tin coffee pot waited on the counter, scrubbed clean of yesterday's grounds. By 6 a.m., the scent of strong black coffee filled the shack, mingling with the faint tang of oiled leather. The place was small enough that every sound, water dripping in the sink, the faint hum of the refrigerator, seemed louder, more deliberate. Thomas lived on $1,133 a month, every bill calculated down to the cent. His life was a series of quiet economies: patch the same jacket instead of buying a new one, change the oil himself, take the long way on his bicycle to avoid the road with the steep hill that made his head swim. Those dizzy spells came without warning, a sudden tilt of the floor beneath his feet, and they were often accompanied by the other thing, the itch. The itch was the worst at night, in the dark, when there was nothing to distract him. It started as a tingle on his forearms, then spread into a heat that felt like 1,000 ants marching beneath his skin. The scars were permanent, rough, uneven patches where the surface looked as if someone had raked a small fork over it and stripped the flesh clean, leaving it to heal into something alien. The VA doctors called it skin cancer, the long-term souvenir of his time in the jungles of Vietnam, where Agent Orange clung invisibly to the leaves, the soil, and, inevitably, to him. He didn't talk about the war much, at least not to people who hadn't been there. Every so often, though, something small would set him off. A news report about another veteran's benefits denied, a clerk at the post office giving him the wrong form. The burst would be sharp and fast, words hard enough to cut, before he'd rein himself back in, jaw tight, breathing slow, eyes turned somewhere far away. The VA called it post-traumatic stress. Thomas called it reacting when something's not right. In town, people knew him as the quiet man who fixed things. A lawnmower that wouldn't start, a hinge that squeaked, a broken latch on a fence. He'd show up with his small toolbox, repair it without fuss, and leave before you could press a few bills into his hand. His only payment seemed to be the satisfaction of seeing something set right. Inside the shack, there was no clutter, no wasted space. A single bed, a wooden chair beside it, a narrow table against the wall, worn smooth where his forearms had rested during countless meals. On that table sat a small, battered radio. Most nights, he'd tune it to the old country station, let the songs play low, while he sat back with a cup of coffee gone cold. If you looked closely, you could see the signs of the long war he'd been fighting since he came home. Not the one in the jungle, but the one in envelopes and filing cabinets. Stacks of correspondence from the VA, neatly bundled with twine, lined the bottom shelf of a cupboard. The oldest were yellowing at the edges, each stamped with some version of the same phrase, insufficient evidence. Additional documentation required, claim under review, 30 years worth of the system telling him to wait. And still, he waited. Still, he kept the shack in perfect order, as if the discipline could hold the rest of his life together. Still, he woke at 5 a.m., folded the bed, polished the boots, made the coffee. Somewhere, maybe deep down, he believed the letter would come one day. Until then, Thomas Reed lived the way he'd been trained to live, strong, quiet, and ready. It began with the spots. They'd been there for years, pale and harmless looking, scattered across his forearms like faded freckles. But lately they had started to change, angrier somehow, redder around the edges and raised enough to catch on the sleeve of his shirt. The itching came next, and it was relentless. It didn't matter if he scratched until his nails left marks. The itch sat deeper than skin, pulsing like a signal from someplace he couldn't reach. Sometimes it burned, a hot crawl under the flesh that made him grit his teeth. Other times it felt like a swarm of ants had burrowed in, all moving at once. And then there were the dizzy spells. They arrived without warning, a sudden sway of the ground, the horizon tipping just enough to send his hand out toward the nearest wall or chair. He learned to stand still until it passed, counting his breaths, willing his balance back. One late morning in early summer, Thomas was trimming the weeds along the side of the shack when it hit him harder than usual. The sunlight flashed too bright in his eyes, and the air seemed to thin. He gripped the handle of the weed trimmer, knuckles white, and staggered toward the porch. The wooden steps swam in front of him. "Whoa there, Tom." It was Mrs. Wilkins from next door, a woman in her 70s who still kept her hair in the same neat bun she'd worn since her teaching days. She hurried over, her small frame moving faster than he thought possible. "You all right?" she asked, her hand hovering near his arm but not touching it. "Fine," he said, steadying himself against the porch rail. "Just a little dizzy, that's all." She gave him a look that said she didn't buy it, but she didn't press. He hated being fussed over. He stood there until the spinning eased, then nodded toward her yard. "Your gate's still sticking? I'll fix it this week." That night, the itch kept him awake. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the sound of cicadas swelling and fading through the open window. When the darkness pressed too close, He reached for the radio and turned it low. A mournful country ballad filled the shack, the singer's voice carrying a kind of weary acceptance Thomas understood all too well. The next afternoon, a familiar knock sounded on the door, 2 quick raps, then one slow. Bill Carter. Thomas opened the door to see his old friend standing there with a six-pack and the same crooked grin he'd worn in the service. They'd met in the jungle, back when they were both young enough to believe they could outrun anything. "You look like hell," Bill said without malice, stepping inside. "Good to see you too." They settled on the porch with coffee instead of beer. Both of them had given up drinking years ago and let the heat of the day settle around them. "How's the VA treating you?" Bill asked, leaning back in the chair. Thomas huffed a short laugh. "Same as always. We're working on it." He said the phrase in a flat imitation of the clerk's voice, and they both laughed, though it wasn't really funny. 28 years for me," Bill said. "Still no movement. I swear, I think they're just waiting us out." "Feels that way," Thomas said, looking out at the dusty road. A pickup rumbled past, leaving a thin trail of grit in the air. They talked for another hour, about nothing and everything, about the war, but only in pieces, skipping over the worst of it. About the price of gas, the weather, the kids who rode their bikes too fast down the street. When Bill finally stood to leave, Thomas felt the itch rising again, a slow crawl from his wrist to his elbow. He clenched his hand, willing himself not to scratch until Bill was out of sight. Alone again, he stepped inside and looked at the bed, perfect, untouched, the boots lined up under it, the stack of shirts on the shelf, all in their place. It was the one thing he could still control. It happened late on a Wednesday night. Thomas had been in the shower, letting the hot water beat against his shoulders, trying to quiet the itch that had spread down his arms and across his chest. Steam fogged the small bathroom mirror, and the air was thick with the scent of soap and the faint metallic tang of well water. He stepped out, reaching for the towel, when the floor seemed to tilt under him. His vision tightened into a narrow tunnel. He tried to steady himself, but his bare feet slid on the damp tile. In the next instant, his hip struck the side of the tub, and he went down hard on one knee, his shoulder smacking the wall. For a few seconds, all he could hear was the thud of his own heartbeat. The dizziness swelled, and the itch was suddenly unbearable, searing up his arms in hot, prickling waves. He stayed there, crouched on the floor, until the spinning slowed enough for him to breathe evenly. The next morning, the soreness in his hip made even the smallest movement stiff. He debated staying home, but the lingering lightheadedness finally pushed him to walk to the clinic. The town's medical center was small, 3 exam rooms, a single nurse at the front desk, and a doctor who'd been there long enough to know every patient by name. "Morning, Tom," the nurse said, scanning him with the practiced eye of someone who could spot trouble at a glance. "What brings you in?" "Fell in the bathroom," he said simply. "Been having dizzy spells." And he tugged at his sleeve, revealing the angry rough patches along his forearms. "This has been worse lately." She frowned and scribbled a note. "Let's have Dr. Harris take a look." In the exam room, Dr. Harris listened quietly as Thomas described the fall, the years of itching, and the strange way the spots had spread. The doctor's hands were gentle but thorough, pressing along Thomas's arms, checking the texture of the skin, the swelling at the edges of the lesions. "Chronic dermatitis," Harris said at last, though his expression was troubled. "Given your history, I'm concerned this could be linked to your service, specifically to Agent Orange exposure." Thomas gave a small nod, as if the words were confirmation of something he'd known all along. "I want you to follow up with dermatology," Harris continued, jotting down a referral, "and neurology, for the dizziness. We should run some blood work today. I'll also document everything for your VA file." "They'll just say we're working on it," Thomas said, not bitter so much as resigned. "Maybe," Harris admitted. "But the more records you have, the harder it is for them to ignore. You need to push this, Tom. Don't wait for them to come to you." Thomas met the doctor's gaze, his face unreadable. "I've been pushing for 30 years. When he left the clinic, the late afternoon sun slanted low across the street. He stopped at the small hardware store to pick up a new latch for Mrs. Wilkins's gate, then walked the last mile home. Inside the shack, he set the latch on the table, then reached for the mop. The bathroom floor still bore the faint marks of his fall, a small scuff on the wall, a darker patch on the tile where the water had pooled. He mopped it clean, wrung out the head until it was nearly dry, and hung it back on its hook. Then he went to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and pulled off his boots. He placed them side by side, toes forward, the leather catching the last streak of daylight through the window. For a long while he just sat there, the quiet of the shack wrapping around him. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the first cool hint of evening. The dizziness was gone for now. The itch, too, had eased. But both would be back. They always came back. The weeks that followed became a blur of appointments, blood draws, skin biopsies, vision tests, each one scheduled at odd hours that forced him to reorganize the day. The clinic was 15 minutes by bicycle if the weather held, longer if the wind was against him. Sometimes the dizziness forced him to walk the last stretch, pushing the bike beside him like a reluctant companion. In dermatology, a young specialist in a crisp white coat leaned in close to examine the patches along his arms. She ran gloved fingers over the rough, uneven surfaces, her touch gentle but her brow furrowed. "These lesions," she said, "they're consistent with prolonged chemical exposure. Given your service history, I'll note Agent Orange as a possible cause. We'll send these samples to the lab." Thomas only nodded. He'd heard the words before. Possible cause, possible connection. Possibilities didn't open doors at the VA. At neurology, the lights were bright and the air too cold. He sat still while the technician placed small adhesive electrodes across his scalp, wires trailing into a machine that hummed softly. "Just relax," the man said, as if stillness was something Thomas didn't already know by heart. The test measured brain activity, searching for any hidden disruption that could explain the sudden spells of vertigo. Every result, every report, was printed, signed, and tucked into a growing folder. Dr. Harris made sure to keep duplicates, for the file, as he put it. But the VA's letters kept coming, each one a demand for more. Provide unit identification, provide dates of deployment, provide documented location of exposure. He'd given them all this before. Twice, maybe 3 times. But still they asked. One afternoon he pulled down the small wooden box from the top shelf of the wardrobe. The latch stuck, it hadn't been opened in years. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and oil. There, wrapped in a piece of cloth worn thin at the corners, were the relics of another life. His dog tags, the chain still cool against his fingers. The stamped letters and numbers were as clear as the day they'd been pressed. A folded map, the creases deep and fragile, with faint pencil marks circling nameless hills. And a handful of photographs, edges curled, colors faded to the muted palette of memory. In one, a young man stood in front of a Huey helicopter, helmet under his arm, eyes dark and steady. The jungle loomed behind him, dense and wet. The image looked almost like a stranger, but the shape of the mouth, the line of the jaw, was unmistakable. He slid the dog tags into his pocket and carried the box to the table. That evening, he rode into town and handed the contents to the VA claims clerk. "Here," he said, placing the items one by one on the counter. The clerk glanced at them with the mild detachment of someone sorting mail. "Thank you, sir. We'll add these to your file." Thomas hesitated. "That's everything. Unit, dates, location. It's all there." The man offered a polite, practiced smile. "We're working on it." The words hung in the air like a bad smell. Thomas turned and left without another word. Outside, the sun was slipping low, painting the storefront windows in streaks of orange and gold. He pedaled home slowly, the weight of the dog tags absent from his neck for the first time in decades. That night, the shack was quieter than usual. He set the box back on the wardrobe shelf, now empty, and closed the door. On the table, his coffee had gone cold. He drank it anyway, the bitterness grounding him. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then fell silent. He thought of the clerk's voice, the way it had smoothed over the decades of waiting into a single, meaningless phrase. He thought of the tests, the needles, the cold rooms, and the doctors who spoke in careful, non-committal tones. And he thought of the map in that box, the lines he had drawn in pencil all those years ago, marking a place where the leaves had turned a strange pale green before falling to the earth. The rain in the jungle had a sound that never left him. Even now, decades later, lying in the quiet of his shack, he could hear it, the heavy, unbroken drumming of water on leaves, on canvas, on skin. It didn't fall in drops but in ropes, each strand thick enough to sting when it hit your bare arms. At night, it drowned out every other noise except the distant thump of rotor blades. In the memory, he was 20 years old again, his boots sinking into the black mud that pulled at every step. The air was thick, the heat clinging to him like a second skin. They'd been moving for hours, a small patrol weaving through the undergrowth along the river. It was Corporal Jensen who first noticed the trees. "Look sick," he muttered, pointing with the barrel of his rifle. The leaves, usually a deep waxy green, were tinged with a strange pale blue-green, as if all the life had been leached out of them. Along the edges, veins stood out like cracks in old glass. Thomas didn't know what to make of it then. None of them did. The lieutenant ordered them to keep moving. There was a schedule to follow, a rendezvous to make. They pushed on, passing under a clearing where a pair of helicopters had circled earlier in the day. The soil there was darker, damper, and the air smelled faintly of something sharp, chemical, unlike the rot and growth of the jungle floor. That night, they made camp just beyond the clearing. Rain hammered the ponchos they'd strung up between the trees. Thomas lay awake, his rifle across his chest, listening to the jungle breathe. Somewhere out there, a tree frog croaked, and then another answered. Years later, in the VA clinic, a doctor would show him a diagram of molecular structures, explain how herbicides had been sprayed in patterns across the countryside, seeping into the ground, the water, the bodies of anyone in range. But in 1969, all Thomas knew was that the next morning, the leaves were gone from the trees above their camp. The branches looked skeletal, reaching into the sky like the hands of something drowned. The flashback tightened around him even now. The smell came back first, that faint sting in his nose, a cousin to diesel fuel but colder somehow. Then the sound of boots in wet mud, the clink of gear, the hiss of rain sliding off the barrel of his rifle. He remembered brushing past a low branch and feeling the wet slap of leaves on his skin. Back in the shack, he lifted his arm and looked at the scars. The skin there was rough, uneven, the color a permanent reminder. Sometimes, on bad nights, the itch would start in that exact spot and spread outward, until it felt as if the jungle itself had climbed under his skin. One image always lingered from those days, a moment when they broke through the tree line and looked out over a small hamlet. The roofs of the huts were slick with rain, and in the open spaces between them the ground was bare. No grass, no weeds, just dirt, as if something had burned away every living thing. A child had stood in the doorway of one hut, staring at them with eyes too old for his face. Thomas never learned the boy's name. He didn't know if the village survived the season. War didn't leave room for those kinds of details. When the flashback loosened its grip, Thomas found himself sitting at the table, the radio silent beside him. His coffee was cold again. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose tin on the roof. He rubbed at the scar on his forearm until the skin turned pink, then forced himself to stop. It wasn't just memory. It was something that had followed him home and stayed, curling itself into his bones. The doctors called it exposure. The VA called it service-connected, but only in the most conditional of terms. To Thomas, it was simply part of the job he had done, a debt his body would keep paying until it couldn't anymore. On the kitchen wall, above the small table where Thomas took most of his meals, hung a calendar the size of a road map. It was one of those free giveaways from the feed store, each month printed over a faded photograph of barns or hayfields. He kept it not for the scenery, but for the space. Big white squares where he could mark the passage of time. Every time he called the VA, he'd take a red pen from the coffee tin on the counter and draw a thick slash across the day. The marks stood out like wounds against the paper. Some weeks had one or two, others were almost solid red. The mail was its own ritual. Every few weeks an envelope would arrive from the Department of Veterans Affairs. He could tell by the weight if it was a form letter or something more, but he opened each one carefully, flattening the creases as if that might change the contents. We regret to inform you. Additional documentation required. Your claim remains under review. They were all the same, really. He stacked them in a neat pile on the cupboard shelf, tied each year's worth with twine. The bundles were beginning to look like a library of unfinished stories. Bill Carter's situation was no different. When they met for coffee at the diner, the conversation always came around to the VA. Got another one today, Bill would say, tapping the folded letter in his pocket. Guess what it said? Thomas didn't have to guess. We're working on it, they said together, in perfect unison, and then laughed the dry, humorless laugh of men who had learned to expect nothing. Still, there was a strange solidarity in it. They were soldiers again, not in the jungle, but on a battlefield made of paper and bureaucracy. Each new letter was another skirmish, each phone call another maneuver in a war that never made the news. Winter bled into spring, spring into summer. The calendar pages turned, each one filling with more red slashes. On the hottest days, Thomas worked early, mowing the small patch of grass beside the shack before the sun could press the air into a heavy, suffocating weight. In the afternoons, he'd fix whatever needed fixing, oil the hinges on the back door, sharpen the blade on the push mower, patch a torn screen for Mrs. Wilkins. The dizziness still came and went, as did the itch. Some nights he'd wake at 2 or 3 in the morning, unable to sleep through the heat crawling under his skin. He'd sit on the porch in the dark, letting the night air cool him, the stars sharp and countless above the black silhouette of the trees. Once Bill came by unannounced, carrying a small paper sack. Inside were 2 old field manuals he'd found while cleaning out his garage. They spent the evening flipping through the pages, the smell of musty paper stirring memories neither of them spoke aloud. When Bill left, Thomas stood at the door for a long time, watching his friend walk down the gravel road. The red slashes on the calendar waited inside, each one a reminder that tomorrow would be just like today, and the day after that. But the calendar stayed up. The pen stayed in the coffee tin. The phone stayed on its hook by the wall. Because one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe next year, the letter might come. From the outside, Thomas's shack looked like something the wind might take in a hard storm. The boards were weathered to the color of driftwood, the roof patched in places with sheets of tin that rattled when the wind came in from the west. But inside, it was as exact and orderly as a barracks inspection. The day always began at 5 a.m., the alarm clock clicking softly before it rang, as if even the machinery understood there was no room for chaos here. Thomas would sit up, swing his feet to the floor, and make the bed with precise, quick motions. The sheet was pulled tight, the blanket folded at the foot in a perfect square, the corners sharp enough to pass the coin bounce test they'd drilled into him half a lifetime ago. His boots were always next, sitting just under the bed, aligned so the toes faced the same way, polished to a dull, even shine. Above them, on a small shelf, his shirts were folded with military precision, each one the exact same width, stacked from lightest fabric to heaviest. Even his work gloves were folded once at the wrist, fingers pointing toward the wall. The shack was one room, more or less, with the bed tucked in one corner, the kitchen along the opposite wall, and a table in between. A mop hung neatly beside the door, the bristles cut evenly across the bottom. The floorboards, though old, gleamed from daily sweeping and a weekly scrub. By 6 the coffee pot was bubbling, the smell of strong black coffee mixing with the faint scent of oiled leather from his boots. He drank it at the table, never anywhere else, the mug set down in the same spot each time. A small clock on the shelf ticked steadily, its brass hands moving with patient certainty. If something was broken, Thomas fixed it immediately. A loose hinge, a chair leg that wobbled, a drawer that stuck. Nothing was left for later. He carried the same habit into the neighborhood. If Mrs. Wilkins's mailbox leaned after a storm, he straightened and reset it. If the gravel in Mr. Porter's driveway washed into the ditch, he shoveled it back. That summer, he rebuilt his own porch steps, replacing the rotting boards with new planks he planed himself. He painted them in 2 coats, sanding between each, and when they were dry, he swept the dust away as if preparing for inspection. Nothing in the shack was for show, but everything had its place. His few photographs, most of them black and white, were tucked into a small frame on the shelf. One was of his parents standing in front of a car with tail fins so big they looked like wings. Another showed a younger Thomas in fatigues, holding his helmet under his arm, the edges of the picture worn where it had been handled too often. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, he'd oil the hinges on the front door just because the sound of the metal moving smoothly pleased him. Other days, he'd sit on the porch with the radio tuned low, sipping coffee that had gone cold, watching the road curve away between the trees. There was no clutter, no stacks of magazines, no stray tools, no unwashed dishes in the sink. It was the kind of order that came from years of needing to control whatever you could, because so much else was beyond reach. The shack might have been small, but it was his, and it was always ready, just like the man who lived there. It came on a Thursday morning in late September, tucked among the usual stack of grocery flyers and utility bills. The envelope was heavier than normal, the paper thick, the VA return address printed in that familiar no-nonsense font. Thomas held it for a moment, feeling the weight in his hand. It was different. He could tell. He carried it inside, setting it down on the table like something fragile. The coffee pot burbled in the background, filling the room with the smell of strong brew, but he didn't pour a cup. Instead, he reached for the letter opener he kept in the top drawer, its handle worn smooth. The envelope gave way with a crisp tear. Inside was a packet of several pages, stapled in the upper corner. His eyes went straight to the first bold line, approved. For a moment, his chest tightened in a way that felt almost like relief. The word blurred for a second before coming back into focus. He scanned the next lines quickly. Monthly pension amount, retroactive adjustments, payment schedule. It was all there. 30 years of waiting, and here it was in black and white. He reached for the phone on the wall, dialing Bill's number by memory. The line rang twice before his friend's voice answered. "They finally did it," Thomas said, and there was a lightness in his voice he hadn't heard in years. "It's here, Bill. Approved." Well, I'll be damned, Bill said, letting out a short laugh. About time, we're celebrating. I'll bring the steaks, you fire up the grill. Sounds good, Thomas said, and he meant it. He could almost taste the smoke and hear the sizzle already. But then, as he turned back to the packet, he saw it. Halfway down the page, in smaller print, approved for review. The words hung there, cold and clinical. He read them again, slower this time. This wasn't a final approval. This wasn't payment. It was a notice that his claim had been moved into yet another phase of consideration. The rush of warmth drained from him, leaving only the familiar weight in his chest. He sat down at the table, the chair creaking under him. The rest of the letter was the same language he'd been reading for years. Evaluations pending, documentation under assessment, timelines undetermined. When Bill showed up that afternoon, the grill stayed cold. Thomas told him about the fine print, the change in meaning. Bill didn't say much, just gave a slow shake of his head. Damn shame, he murmured. They sat on the porch instead, the unopened steaks between them. Thomas kept the packet on the table inside, where he could see it through the screen door. For hours it lay there in the sunlight, its edges curling slightly as the day wore on. By evening he slid it into the folder with the others, tying the bundle shut. The calendar on the wall waited for another red slash. He picked up the pen, hesitated, then drew the line anyway. Thick and final. Outside, the first cool wind of autumn moved through the trees. The tin roof gave a soft, restless rattle. Thomas poured himself a cup of coffee gone bitter with age and took it out to the porch, sipping in silence. By November, the lesions on his arms had thickened, the skin rough as sandpaper and mottled with angry reddish patches. The itch was no longer something he could push aside with discipline. It woke him at night, burning under the surface like a rash made of fire. Sometimes he'd stand in the kitchen at 2 a.m, sleeves rolled up, holding his arms under the cold tap until they went numb. The dizziness returned in sharper bursts, hitting him without warning. One afternoon, while tightening the hinge on Mrs. Wilkins's gate, the ground lurched under his feet. He grabbed the post, knuckles whitening, and waited for the horizon to steady. Mrs. Wilkins, watching from her porch, called out to ask if he needed a break. Just a little lightheaded, he told her, but his voice was tight, the words clipped short. Then came the night he hit the floor again. He'd been brushing his teeth, leaning over the small porcelain sink, when the room tilted hard to the right. His shoulder slammed into the wall, and he went down to his knees. The toothbrush clattered into the basin. He stayed there for a long moment, breathing through his nose, eyes closed against the spinning. Dr. Harris insisted on another round of tests. Your balance issues are worsening, the doctor said. We can't ignore this. The next week, while Thomas was waiting in the clinic lobby, Bill's wife came in, her face pale and tight. Bill had been admitted to the hospital 2 towns over, complications with his lungs. Thomas visited the next day, the hospital's antiseptic smell sharp in his nose. Bill lay in bed with an oxygen cannula resting under his nose, the thin plastic tubing framing his weathered face. Looks worse than it is, Bill rasped, but the way his chest rose and fell in shallow pulls told a different story. You get out of here soon, Thomas said. Sure, Bill said with a tired grin, as soon as the VA decides I'm fit for duty. It was an old joke, but neither of them laughed. That night, back in the shack, Thomas sat at the table with the light off, the window open to the sound of wind moving through the bare branches. He rested his hands flat on the wood, the rough skin catching against the grain. How much longer? He asked the empty room. Not aloud, not quite. The question hung there anyway, as heavy as the stack of letters in the cupboard. The answer, like always, was silence. It was a sharp, clear morning in late January when the call came. The phone rang twice before Thomas picked it up, pressing the receiver to his ear. On the other end, Bill's wife spoke quietly, her voice thin and flat. He passed early this morning, she said. The words hung in the air, and for a moment Thomas didn't move. Outside, sunlight filtered through the bare branches, casting a lacework of shadows on the porch steps he had rebuilt last summer. He gripped the phone a little tighter, the cord stretching between his hand and the wall. I'm sorry, he said finally, because there was nothing else to say. The funeral was 3 days later. The sky that morning was the color of dull steel, low clouds pressing down on the small-town cemetery. A handful of cars lined the gravel lane. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and pine from the trees that marked the boundary of the grounds. Bill's casket rested at the front, draped in the American flag. 2 young servicemen in dress blues stood at attention beside it, their breath making pale clouds in the cold. The pastor spoke in a low, steady voice, his words nearly lost to the wind. Thomas stood near the back, hat in hand, boots planted firmly in the frozen ground. He watched as the honor guard moved with precise, practiced motions, folding the flag into a perfect triangle. Each crease was sharp, each movement silent, except for the soft rustle of fabric. When the final fold was made, one of the young soldiers turned and placed the flag into the hands of Bill's wife. She held it against her chest, her fingers curling into the cloth as if it might slip away. Thomas's gaze lingered on the flag. There was something almost cruel about the perfection of it, the symmetry, the crispness, the sense that here, at least, everything was done right. In the field, they had been told that order was what kept men alive. But here, order came after the fact, too late to save anyone. As the service ended, a rifle volley cracked the air, 3 sharp reports that echoed against the trees. The sound carried Thomas back decades in an instant, the smell of wet canvas, the hiss of rain on metal, the metallic tang of spent casings hitting the ground. People moved slowly toward their cars, speaking in hushed voices. Thomas stayed where he was until the cemetery was nearly empty. Only then did he step forward, stopping beside the casket. He placed his hand on the smooth wood, feeling the cold through his palm. "See you on the other side, Bill," he murmured. That night, the shack felt smaller somehow, the quiet heavier. On the table sat the same coffee mug Thomas had used that morning, half full and long gone cold. He left it there. In the corner, the stack of VA letters seemed to lean forward, as if waiting for him to open the next one. For days afterward, the image of the folded flag stayed with him. It came back while he was fixing Mrs. Wilkins's screen door, while he swept the porch, while he polished his boots. The memory was sharp, and with it came a question he never spoke aloud. When will it be my turn? The VA letter for February arrived on schedule, as if nothing had changed. The same heavy paper, the same official font, the same words he could recite by heart. He didn't open it right away this time. It sat on the shelf for 2 days before he slid a thumb under the flap and tore it open. "Your claim remains under review." The phrase was almost comical now, like a bad line in a play that no one ever rewrote. Thomas folded the letter once, then again, and slipped it into the bundle for that year. The twine around the stack was beginning to fray, but it held. That evening, he sat on the porch with the radio on low, the cold air biting at his cheeks. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Above him, the sky cleared, revealing a scatter of bright winter stars. He thought about Bill, not just the man in the hospital bed or the casket, but the young soldier in the jungle, grinning through the rain. He thought about the years between, the slow grind of time and paperwork and waiting, and in the back of his mind, the folded flag waited too, as sharp and precise as the day it had been handed over. The call came on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind where the clouds looked heavy enough to press the rooftops flat. Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee when the phone rang. "Mr. Reed?" a woman's voice asked. It was crisp, but not unfriendly. "Speaking. This is Sarah Collins. I'm with the Veterans Affairs Regional Office. I've been reviewing some of our older files and yours caught my attention." She paused, as if measuring her next words. "It's been pending for quite some time." Thomas let the silence stretch. 30 years, he said finally. "I saw that," she replied, and there was something in her tone, an undercurrent of disbelief, maybe even shame. "I wanted to let you know I'm going to push for a final decision. Your file has everything it needs. It should have been resolved years ago." Years ago. He had heard those 2 words in many flavors over the decades, from lawyers, from doctors, from clerks reading notes off a screen, but this time the voice on the other end didn't sound like it was ticking boxes. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked. "It means I'm flagging it for immediate review," Sarah said. "I'll make sure it's on my supervisor's desk by the end of the week." Thomas pictured the file, fat, overstuffed, the dog tags and photographs buried among forms and test results. He'd imagined it many times, sitting in some back room gathering dust. "People have said that before," he told her. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm not them." He didn't answer right away. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the loose tin panel on the roof. Somewhere down the road, a car passed, its tires hissing on the wet pavement. "All right," he said finally. After they hung up, he stayed at the table for a long time, staring at the phone as if it might ring again. The words she'd used, immediate review, were still turning over in his mind. They felt like a door opening a fraction of an inch, letting in a line of light. That afternoon, he swept the porch even though it didn't need it, and polished the boots he kept under the bed. It wasn't celebration, he wasn't ready for that. But something about the conversation had settled under his skin. 2 days later, another envelope from the VA arrived. This one was thinner than usual, just a single sheet inside. Your claim is in the final stages of adjudication. A decision is expected in the first quarter of the coming year. He read it twice. The language was still bureaucratic, but there was a date now, something that had been missing for decades. That evening, he sat on the porch with the letter in his lap. The air was cold enough to make his breath visible, but he stayed out until the stars began to show. Somewhere in the darkness, he imagined Bill sitting beside him, grinning in that lopsided way. "They might actually finish it," Thomas said into the night. The wind rustled the trees, and the shack behind him stood as it always had, small, solid, and orderly. The letter arrived in mid-November, just as the last of the leaves were swept from the yard. The VA logo was printed crisp in the corner, the envelope heavier than most, as if carrying more than its share of winter air. Thomas slid it open with the same worn letter opener, sliding the single page free. "Your claim has been finalized. Full pension benefits will be dispersed starting in April of the coming year." He read it again slowly, as if each word might shift under his eyes. April. 4 more months. After 3 decades, it felt like the finish line was in sight, but still far enough away to seem unreal. That night, he placed the letter on the kitchen table, weighed down by his coffee mug so it wouldn't curl. The paper looked almost ceremonial under the yellow light of the bare bulb. In the days that followed, he caught himself thinking about things he hadn't considered in years, maybe replacing the roof, buying a second-hand pickup so he didn't have to pedal into town for every errand. But each time, the thought felt too big, too premature, and he'd fold it away again. December came in with hard frosts, turning the grass brittle underfoot. Thomas patched the draft under the door and stacked firewood against the side of the shack. The mornings were cold enough that he could see his breath inside before the coffee pot hissed to life. When Christmas Eve arrived, the town was quiet under a thin layer of snow. Thomas lit the small radio on the table, tuning it to a station playing old holiday standards. Bing Crosby's voice floated through the room, warm and steady against the hiss of static. He poured himself a cup of coffee, then, almost as an afterthought, reached for the bottle of bourbon he kept in the back of the cupboard. The glass was a simple tumbler, clean and clear. He poured a small measure, set it beside the coffee, and sat down. The shack was lit only by the lamp over the table, the rest of the room in shadow. He raised the glass slightly, looking toward the empty chair across from him. "Bill," he said softly, "you better be having one up there too." The bourbon burned in a way that was almost welcome, threading heat down his chest. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing the faint sound of church bells from somewhere in town. He thought of all the Christmases in between, some spent on patrol under the foreign sky, some alone in this shack, some with the phone ringing and the same phrases from the VA echoing in his ear. He thought about the folded flag at Bill's funeral, about the steady hands that had passed it to a grieving widow, about the precision of the folds, sharp and unyielding. The radio played on, sliding into another song from another decade. Thomas topped off his coffee, letting the steam warm his face. When midnight came, he switched off the radio and sat in the stillness for a while. The April letter still lay on the table, the coffee mug keeping it flat. He picked it up, folded it neatly along its creases, and slipped it into the folder with the others. This one, though, he tied a little more loosely, as if it might need to come out again soon. Before turning in, he paused at the door and looked out at the quiet yard. The snow caught what little light there was, making the ground seem to glow. Somewhere far away, another set of church bells began to chime. 4 more months, he murmured. The words were barely louder than the ticking of the clock. Inside, the shack held its warmth, the boots lined up under the bed, the shirt sleeves pressed and folded. Order, as always, the kind that waited patiently for whatever came next. March arrived with a sky so clear it looked as if winter had been scrubbed away overnight. The air still held a chill, but sunlight spilled over the rooftops, painting long, gold-edged shadows across the road. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, mug in hand, and breathed it in. It had been a long time since the day felt this open, this clean. He'd already made the bed, swept the floor, and polished the boots under the bed, until they gave off a quiet sheen. The coffee was strong, the kind that could stand a spoon upright, and he sipped it slowly, letting the warmth settle into him. On the table inside, the April letter lay folded with the others, but today he didn't look at it. Instead, his eyes drifted to the old bicycle leaning against the side of the shack. It had been months since he'd ridden it, the tires holding just enough air to keep their shape, the chain lightly oiled from habit. He thought about the loop around the neighborhood, 2 miles, maybe 3, nothing strenuous, just a way to feel the wind in his face again. After breakfast, he wheeled the bike into the sunlight. The metal was cool under his hands, the seat worn smooth from years of use. He checked the brakes, tested the tires with a firm squeeze, and found them good enough for the ride. The first turn out of the driveway felt steady, the tires humming against the pavement. The road curved gently between bare-branched maples, the sunlight catching in their high forks. Somewhere a dog barked twice, then quieted. He passed Mrs. Wilkins' house, saw her at the kitchen window, and lifted a hand in greeting. She waved back, her smile small but genuine. Further along, Mr. Porter was raking the last of the winter debris from his yard, the sound of the metal tines scraping over gravel. The neighborhood was waking slowly, children's bikes leaning against fences, a few porch flags stirring in the breeze, the distant sound of a radio playing something twangy and old. Thomas's legs moved easily, the rhythm of pedaling syncing with the steady draw of his breath. He felt the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full of the small order of things in their place. The houses stood square against the morning, the mailboxes upright, the street free of litter. Even the wind seemed measured, cool against his face without pushing too hard. Turning down a side street, he let the bike pick up a little speed. The pavement was smooth here, the sunlight filtering through the branches to dapple the ground in shifting patterns. For a moment, he closed his eyes halfway, the warmth and movement blending into a sensation he hadn't felt in years, ease. As he looped back toward the main road, he thought about what he might do that afternoon, sharpen the mower blade maybe, or oil the hinges on the front door. Simple tasks, the kind that always waited for him and never asked more than he could give. At the next intersection, he slowed slightly, glancing both ways. The street was quiet, except for a single car far behind him, moving at a leisurely pace. He pushed forward, letting the pedals carry him into the curve. The sound of the tires on asphalt was steady, almost soothing. He could hear the faint rattle of the bike's chain, the whisper of the wind through the spokes. The sunlight warmed the back of his neck, and for a fleeting moment he thought, "This is a good morning." He didn't know it would be his last one like this. The car came from behind, quiet at first, the low hum of its engine blending into the background sounds of the morning. Thomas was halfway down the gentle slope toward the main road, the bike rolling smooth beneath him, when the noise shifted, growing closer, sharper. He didn't turn to look. Years of riding had taught him to keep steady, to trust the space behind him. But in the span of a few heartbeats, the hum became a rush, the air at his back disturbed by a mass moving too fast. The impact was small in sound, just a hard cack against the rear tire, but its force was immediate. The bike jolted forward, then sideways, the handlebars wrenching in his grip. Gravity twisted under him, and the world tilted at an impossible angle. For a split second, he was airborne. The road, the trees, the pale blue sky all seemed to turn together, their edges blurred. His hat, the same faded cap he'd worn for years, lifted off his head and tumbled into the grass by the curb. Time slowed in a way that felt both endless and too quick to matter. The sound of his breath roared in his ears. He saw the glint of sunlight on the car's windshield, the driver's head bent towards something in her lap. A phone. Then the ground came up hard. His right side hit first, shoulder, then hip, then the side of his head. The impact was blunt and absolute. A jarring stop that rattled through his teeth. A sharp, electric pain burst behind his eyes, and the rest of the world pulled away, muffled and distant. Somewhere far off, voices rose, high, alarmed, overlapping. Footsteps pounded on pavement. A woman's voice cried out, "Oh my God! Somebody call 911. Thomas tried to push himself up, but his arms felt foreign, disconnected. The sky above was no longer a solid blue. It wavered, colors shifting like water over glass. He blinked, and the branches overhead doubled, then merged again. The bike lay a few feet away, one wheel still spinning lazily. His cap was in the grass, brim bent, a thin smear of dirt across the fabric. He became aware of the driver kneeling beside him, her voice tumbling over itself in a rush of apology. "I didn't see you. I swear I didn't see you. I just looked down for a second." The words slipped past him, indistinct, as if spoken through a wall. Then another face appeared above his, this one older, calmer. A man's hand rested on his shoulder. "Don't move, buddy. Help's on the way. Just stay with me." Thomas's breath came shallow now, each inhale edged with a pressure that made it hard to draw the air in fully. Somewhere deep, a slow, heavy pulse throbbed in his skull. The sirens came quickly, first a faint wail, then louder, closer, until the sound filled the street. Hands were on him again, more of them now, steady and practiced. They checked his pulse, his pupils, asked him questions he couldn't quite hold on to long enough to answer. When they lifted him onto the stretcher, the sky shifted again, spinning above the frame of the ambulance door. He caught a glimpse of Mrs. Wilkins at the edge of the crowd, her hand pressed over her mouth. The last thing he saw before the doors closed was the folded triangle of his cap, lying abandoned in the grass, its brim catching a shard of sunlight. The ceiling above him was an expanse of flat, white light, too bright, too cold. Thomas tried to move his head, but a deep stabbing pain anchored him in place. Somewhere nearby, machines beeped in a slow, methodical rhythm, their tones weaving into the distant hiss of oxygen. A voice floated over him, low but firm. Severe brain bleed. Right temporal lobe. We need to keep him stable. He couldn't see the speaker, only the blur of a shadow moving at the edge of his vision. Another voice, softer, said something about ICU and no visitors yet. The beeping continued, steady as a metronome. He tried to focus on the sound, to hold on to it like a lifeline, but it kept slipping away, replaced by fragments. Faces in jungle rain, the smell of wet canvas, the sound of rotor blades. Hours, or maybe minutes, later, the click of heels approached. Sarah Collins stepped into the room, her hair pulled back, a thick file pressed against her chest. She paused just inside the doorway, taking in the tubes, the wires, the man lying motionless beneath the harsh light. She'd seen his name on the folder so many times over the past few months, her signature scrawled on half the forms, but seeing him here made the paperwork feel like an absurdity, a relic from a world that still believed in timetables. The folder was over an inch thick, its cover stamped with the word finalized in red ink. The decision letter was clipped to the top, full pension, approved, payments to begin in April. All the numbers lined up, every box ticked. Sarah swallowed hard, stepping closer to the bed. "Mr. Reed," she said, keeping her voice even, though she wasn't sure if he could hear her. "It's done. You're getting everything you've been owed." No response. His face was still, the lines around his mouth softened by sedation. She set the folder on the small table beside the bed. It looked out of place among the plastic cups and hospital chart, the kind of thing that belonged in an office, not a room heavy with the scent of antiseptic. The doctor entered, glancing at the monitors before meeting Sarah's eyes. "You're with the VA?" "Yes," she said. "I don't know how much longer." He trailed off, then simply shook his head. Sarah nodded once, more to herself than to him. She stayed for a while, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the slow climb of numbers on the oxygen monitor. When she finally left, the file remained on the table, its edges perfectly squared, untouched. That night, Thomas slipped deeper into the quiet. The beeping slowed, the light above seemed farther away. In his mind, he was back on his bicycle, coasting down a sunlit street, the wind cool against his face. He didn't feel the moment when the machine stopped. A week later, the envelope arrived at the shack. It bore the familiar VA return address and, in the upper right corner, the embossed seal of the United States. The paper was thick, the kind used for official matters, the kind meant to last. It sat in the mailbox until late afternoon, when Sarah Collins pulled her car into the narrow dirt driveway. She stepped out slowly, the gravel crunching under her shoes, the winter air biting at her cheeks. The shack was quiet, the curtains drawn. She opened the mailbox, slid the envelope free, and held it for a moment. The sunlight was low now, spilling long orange beams across the yard, and one of them caught the seal, making it gleam faintly. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood polish and coffee. Everything was in its place. The boots lined under the bed itself made with military corners so sharp they could have cut paper. On the small table in the kitchen, a mug sat upside down on a folded dish towel. Sarah set the envelope down in the center of the table. She hesitated, then slid a finger under the flap and opened it. The letter inside was exactly what she expected, formal language confirming the award of full pension, effective immediately, with back pay calculated to the cent. Her hands trembled just slightly as she folded it closed again. She imagined him sitting here, reading it after all those years of waiting. She pictured the way he might have placed it in that bundle of letters, tying it with the same worn twine, maybe letting himself feel something that had been denied for decades. But the room was silent. The only sound came from the faint ticking of a wall clock. She glanced toward the wall where a single peg held his cap, the brim bent from years of wear, a faint smudge still visible from where it had landed in the grass the day of the accident. The boots caught her eye again, perfectly aligned, their leather still holding a soft shine. They looked ready to be stepped into, ready for the day to start. But the man who'd kept them so was gone, and the order he left behind felt both comforting and unbearably sad. She stayed a little while, walking the perimeter of the small room, her fingers brushing over the back of a chair, the edge of the counter, the smooth wood of the doorframe. Everything here bore his touch, the quiet precision of someone who had kept control over what little he could. When she finally stepped outside, the sun was sinking low, the yard bathed in the deep gold of late winter dusk. She locked the door behind her, the envelope still resting on the table inside, where the light from the window reached it like a spotlight. From the driveway, she took one last look at the shack. It stood small but steady, just as he had described it in one of their few conversations. The trees at its back swayed gently, their branches whispering in the wind. As she drove away, Sarah thought about the word finalized stamped on his file. It was true in every sense now, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a truth delivered too late to matter, a promise kept only after the person it was made to was gone. Back inside the shack, the boots would stay lined up, the bed would stay made, and the letter would wait in silence. Opened, read, and returned to the table, a message that had found its way home but not its intended reader. The porch creaked under the weight of boots as the veterans gathered. Most of them wore old field jackets or faded ball caps stitched with the names of units that no longer existed. They carried things in their hands, small offerings for the man who wasn't there. One brought a battered AM/FM radio, the same model Thomas had kept on his kitchen shelf for decades. Another carried a flag, neatly folded into a triangle, its stars facing outward. A third held a pack of black coffee, still sealed, the kind Thomas favored. They didn't speak much at first. They just stood there, letting the cold air move between them, looking out at the yard that stretched toward the road. The shack behind them was locked, the windows closed, but the place still felt occupied, as if its owner had only stepped away for a moment. Finally, one of the older men, his hair white under his cap, cleared his throat. "I knew him in '70, he said. "First time we met, it was raining so hard we could barely see. He was cleaning his rifle like we were sitting in a sunny kitchen. Didn't matter if the sky was falling. He kept things in order." Another man chuckled softly. "Yeah, that was him. Could have been knee-deep in mud, and he'd still fold his socks." They swapped memories the way soldiers do, sparing the details but hitting the truth. They talked about the jungle, about nights when the air was so thick you could taste the rain, about the strange green mist that rolled over the treetops one morning, and the orders to keep moving. None of them had called it Agent Orange back then. Sarah stood a little apart, listening. She had the decision letter in her hand, still in its envelope. The paper inside felt heavier than it should, as if the years it represented had soaked into the fibers. One of the men noticed her and nodded toward the letter. "That his?" "Yes," she said. "It's what he was waiting for." The man looked at her for a long moment before saying, "Too late, though." She didn't argue. The truth was as plain as the frost on the porch railing. The stories went on, about the time Thomas fixed a broken field stove with nothing but a strip of wire, about how he once gave away his last pack of cigarettes to a young private who'd just lost a friend, about the way he never raised his voice unless something was truly wrong. As the afternoon slipped toward evening, the light began to change. The sky over the trees turned from pale blue to a deep, glowing orange. It spread slowly, washing over the yard, catching on the edges of the folded flag, on the curve of the coffee mug someone had set on the porch rail. Sarah looked up at it, the letter still clutched in her hand. She thought about promises, the kind made in offices, the kind made between friends, the kind you carry for years without realizing how heavy they've become. One by one, the men drifted away, leaving their offerings where they sat. The radio on the steps, the coffee beside the door, the flag in the rocking chair. The porch creaked again as the last of them stepped down, boots crunching on the gravel. Sarah stayed until the orange faded to purple, until the cold reached through her coat and into her bones. Before she left, she placed the envelope on the seat of the rocking chair, tucking it beneath the folded flag so it wouldn't blow away. When she stepped off the porch, the shack stood behind her in silence. Somewhere beyond the trees, the sky was still burning with the last light of the day. Some promises are kept, some are broken, and some arrive only when there's no one left to hear them. Some lives are measured in years, others in the number of battles they've fought, both on the field and long after the war ends. Thomas Reed's fight was never about medals or parades. It was about recognition, about dignity, about a promise made to a soldier that should never have been delayed. I hope you remember the image of that shack. Boots aligned under the bed, a folded flag resting on a chair, and a letter that came too late. Let it remind us that justice delayed can become justice denied. Have you ever known someone who waited far too long for what they deserved? Share their story in the comments. Let's make sure their names and their battles are not forgotten. If this story touched you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss the stories that need to be told, stories of courage, endurance, and the quiet fight to be seen.